In 1991, an airplane that Soviet generals mocked as a gimmick flew more than 1,300 combat sorties into the most heavily defended airspace on Earth, and not one came back with a single loss. It did not win by speed or altitude, it won by vanishing from the rules everyone thought were permanent. The proof started months earlier, on the evening of August 20, 1990, when Captain Rob Donaldson stood on the tarmac at Khamis Mushat Air Base in southwestern Saudi Arabia and watched dark shapes form out of the runway haze. At 2300 hours, the first F-117 touched down, then another, arriving in precise intervals until 18 angular black aircraft sat in the humid desert air 650 miles south of Baghdad. Flashlights slid across surfaces that seemed to swallow light, as if the planes were made to erase themselves rather than to fly. Donaldson had spent 6 years in F-15Es and thought he knew every major fighter in the American inventory, but these faceted shadows looked like geometric experiments that had somehow learned how to hunt. The confidence Donaldson observed that night had been earned through nearly a decade of secret operations from Tonopah Test Range in Nevada, where F-117 pilots had flown only at night, maintaining a fiction of normalcy by day while executing the most revolutionary tactical aviation program in history after sunset. But that confidence had not extended to America's adversaries or even to many within the American defense establishment when the stealth program first emerged from the Black World in 1988. Soviet military commentators, accustomed to generations of aerial warfare in which radar and surface-to-air missiles had fundamentally altered the calculus of air power, expressed public skepticism about American claims regarding stealth technology. In technical journals and military academies across the Soviet Union, analysts noted that their integrated air defense networks had forced American bombers to abandon daylight operations over North Vietnam and had inflicted devastating losses on Israeli aircraft during the Yom Kippur War of 1973. The mathematics of radar cross-section and the physics of electromagnetic wave reflection were well understood, and Soviet engineers had access to the same fundamental principles that guided American research. When the Pentagon released grainy photographs of the F-117 in November 1988, showing an aircraft that looked like it had been assembled from flat black panels, some Soviet commentators saw confirmation of their assessment that existing radar systems, particularly those operating at lower frequencies, would maintain detection capabilities against these so-called invisible aircraft. The skepticism reflected a deeper Soviet confidence in their air defense philosophy, built over decades of investment and validated by real-world performance. After a Soviet SA-2 surface-to-air missile brought down Francis Gary Powers in his U-2 reconnaissance aircraft over Sverdlovsk on May 1, 1960, the Soviet Union had continued developing increasingly sophisticated radar-guided weapons that fundamentally challenged Western air superiority. By the mid-1970s, Soviet-supplied SAM batteries ringed every strategically important location from Hanoi to Damascus, creating interlocking zones of coverage that forced attacking aircraft into killing envelopes where speed, maneuverability, and electronic countermeasures became matters of life and death. A 1974 Defense Science Board assessment warned that NATO airstrikes would be prevented entirely by Warsaw Pact air defenses in any future European conflict, a conclusion that crystallized Pentagon understanding that the existing paradigm of tactical aviation was approaching obsolescence. Soviet generals understood this calculus intimately because they had created it, investing billions of rubles in radar technology, command and control networks, and missile systems designed specifically to deny airspace to American aircraft. The idea that geometric shaping and radar-absorbent materials could somehow negate this entire architecture seemed to many Soviet analysts like American technological optimism disconnected from the realities of electromagnetic physics. But those Soviet analysts did not know that the mathematical foundation for American stealth technology had originated in their own country, in the work of a physicist named Petr Ufimtsev. In 1962, Ufimtsev published a paper on the theoretical calculation of electromagnetic wave reflection from simple geometric shapes, work he considered purely academic with no immediate practical application. Soviet military researchers apparently agreed, allowing the paper to be published openly and eventually translated into English. In 1975, a Lockheed analyst named Denis Overholser discovered Ufimtsev's work while researching radar cross-section reduction for the CIA's request following the U-2 shootdown. Overholser realized that Ufimtsev's equations could be programmed into computers to predict how radar waves would interact with complex three-dimensional shapes, and more importantly, how those shapes could be designed to deflect radar energy away from its source rather than reflecting it back. He created what became known as the Overholser calculator, software that could model radar return from faceted surfaces by treating each flat panel as a simple geometric plane. The insight led directly to the hopeless diamond design, a faceted aircraft shape that when tested against a wooden pole at White Sands, New Mexico in March 1976, returned a smaller radar signature than the pole itself. Soviet theoretical mathematics had enabled American engineers to make an aircraft functionally invisible to the very radar systems Soviet industry had spent decades perfecting. The Have Blue demonstrator program that followed produced two subscale prototypes that proved the concept between December 1977 and mid-1979, though both aircraft eventually crashed during testing. On November 16, 1978, Lockheed received the contract for Senior Trend, the full-scale production program that would become the F-117. When test pilot Hal Farley lifted the first production F-117 off the runway at Groom Lake on June 18, 1981, he was flying an aircraft unlike anything that had come before, a machine whose design priorities inverted 60 years of aeronautical engineering. The F-117 measured 65.6 feet long with a wingspan of just 27 feet, giving it stubby proportions that suggested it should not fly at all. Its faceted surfaces, necessitated by 1970s computer limitations that could only calculate radar return from flat panels, created an aircraft composed of dozens of precisely angled planes joined at sharp edges. Two General Electric F404 turbofan engines, each producing approximately 10,000 pounds of thrust, pushed the aircraft to a maximum speed of Mach 0.92, respectable but unremarkable by fighter standards. The engines fed through intakes covered with radar-deflecting grids and exhausted through non-circular slit-shaped tailpipes designed to minimize infrared signature, with heat-absorbing tiles further reducing thermal visibility. Nearly 1 ton of radar-absorbent material covered the airframe, held in place by specialized adhesives and requiring constant maintenance with putty carefully applied to seal every gap and fastener head. The aircraft carried no radar of its own, relying instead on an inertial navigation system and an infrared targeting system to find and designate targets in complete electronic silence. Inside the weapons bay it could carry two 2,000-pound GBU-27 laser-guided bombs, precision weapons that could be dropped from altitudes above most effective anti-aircraft fire and guided onto target coordinates entered before takeoff. The cockpit featured a heads-up display adapted from other programs and flight controls derived from F-16 fly-by-wire systems, quadruple redundant computers that made constant adjustments because the F-117 was aerodynamically unstable in all three axes. Pilots soon discovered that flying the aircraft required constant attention and smooth control inputs, any aggressive maneuvering causing the flight control computers to intervene with corrections that could induce oscillations. Some called it the wobbling goblin, though pilots who mastered the aircraft insisted it flew predictably once you understood its characteristics. Its radar cross-section measured between 0.001 and 0.003 square meters, roughly equivalent to 3 large insects or a hummingbird, compared to 4 square meters for an F-16 or 25 square meters for an F-15. On radar screens calibrated to detect conventional aircraft at ranges exceeding 100 miles, the F-11 would rear, if it appeared at all, as momentary clutter indistinguishable from ground return or atmospheric interference. By October 1983, the F-117 achieved initial operating capability with the 4450th Tactical Group operating from Tonopah Test Range Airport in Nevada, a remote facility where the aircraft could be maintained and flown in complete secrecy. For the next 5 years, F-117 pilots maintained cover jobs during the day and flew only after sunset. Their families told they worked on A-7 aircraft while the actual mission remained classified at the highest levels. The aircraft were transported to and from Lockheed's Palmdale depot inside C-5 cargo planes, disassembled and cradled to protect their delicate surfaces, moved only under darkness. Maintenance crews spent hours before each flight carefully applying putty to seal seams and fastener heads, creating the smooth continuous surfaces necessary to maintain stealth characteristics. The effort required to keep 59 production aircraft operational created a logistics burden unlike anything the Air Force had previously attempted, with specialized tools, materials and procedures that could not be shared with the broader maintenance community because the program's existence remained officially unacknowledged until November 10, 1988. Even after public acknowledgement, the Air Force released only limited information, and the first formal public appearance did not occur until April 1990 at Nellis Air Force Base, where the angular black shape finally emerged from operational security that had lasted nearly a decade. That operational security had been necessary in part because of what CIA assessments revealed about Soviet intelligence collection on American stealth programs. A 1988 CIA memorandum noted that aviation journalist Bill Sweetman was frequently cited in Soviet military publications and that his reporting accounted for 40% of references to Western press sources in Soviet stealth literature. The agency concluded that the Soviets likely had a good understanding of American stealth programs and had begun their own development efforts, though the CIA's 1985 assessment had predicted that Soviet air defenses would remain vulnerable to stealth aerodynamic systems for at least the next decade. What Soviet intelligence could not fully determine from open-source reporting and whatever classified information reached Moscow through espionage was exactly how effective stealth technology would prove in actual combat against a modern integrated air defense network. Throughout the late 1980s, as the F-117 force grew toward its final total of 59 production aircraft, debates continued within military and technical communities about whether stealth represented a genuine revolution or an incremental improvement that clever adversaries could counter through operational adaptation and improved radar technology. Soviet confidence in their air defense systems rested on solid historical foundation, validated by every major conflict since 1960. The theoretical possibility that an aircraft could penetrate defended airspace without being detected, tracked, and engaged seemed to contradict decades of operational experience. That confidence began to fracture in the early morning hours of January 17, 1991, when Major Greg Feast released a 2,000-pound laser-guided bomb over an Iraqi interceptor operations center near Nukaib, 150 miles inside Iraq. The time was 2:51 a.m. local, 9 minutes before the official start of Operation Desert Storm, and Feast's bomb became the first of the war. At exactly 3 a.m., 10 F-117s approached Baghdad along carefully planned routes that brought them over the most heavily defended city on Earth from directions Iraqi air defense operators did not expect, and at altitudes where they had been trained to expect radar returns. Baghdad's defenses included 7,000 radar-guided missiles, 9,000 infrared-guided missiles, 7,000 anti-aircraft guns, and more than 60 SAM batteries integrated into a command and control network modeled on Soviet doctrine and operated by personnel trained in Soviet tactics. The Iraqi Air Force maintained 800 fighter aircraft, though many would never launch, and more than 3,000 anti-aircraft artillery pieces ringed the capital in concentric layers designed to create interlocking fields of fire. Coalition planners considered Baghdad the most heavily defended city on Earth, and they did not risk conventional strike packages against downtown targets that first night. Only the F-117s went into the heart of the integrated air defense network, flying without electronic jamming support, without fighter escorts, without the elaborate packages of Wild Weasel defense suppression aircraft and standoff jammers that would accompany every other strike into defended airspace throughout the war. Iraqi radar operators watched their screens as the air war began, tracking the waves of cruise missiles launched from ships in the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean, detecting and attempting to engage the conventional strike packages hitting targets in western Iraq and along the Kuwaiti border. But the F-117s approaching Baghdad did not register as coherent tracks on Iraqi radar displays. Individual operators may have seen momentary returns, brief flickers that appeared for one sweep and disappeared the next, clutter that training and doctrine taught them to ignore as ground return or atmospheric interference. By the time the first bombs began detonating on telecommunications facilities, air defense operations centers, and command bunkers throughout Baghdad, Iraqi defense operators had no clear picture of what had attacked them. The bombs arrived without warning, without the buildup of radar tracks that would indicate an incoming strike package, without the telltale signatures of electronic jamming that would signal an imminent attack. Post-strike damage assessment revealed that F-117s had hit 31% of all targets attacked on the first day of the war, despite representing only 2% of coalition tactical aircraft. Through the pre-dawn darkness of January 17th, 30 F-117s struck 37 high-value targets in the opening 24 hours, initiating a campaign that would continue for 43 days and 1,200 sorties without a single aircraft lost or damaged. The operational pattern established on the first night continued throughout Desert Storm as planners assigned the most heavily defended, highest-value targets to F-117 units, while conventional aircraft struck less critical objectives or attacked only after defenses had been suppressed. F-117s operated exclusively at night, taking off from Khamis Mushat in southwestern Saudi Arabia for missions averaging 5.4 hours that included aerial refueling on both the inbound and outbound legs. Pilots navigated using inertial systems updated with GPS coordinates, flying pre-planned routes that brought them to target areas where they would designate aim points with onboard laser systems and release GBU-27 bombs that guided themselves to impact. The aircraft flew at altitudes generally between 20,000 and 30,000 feet, above most effective anti-aircraft artillery, but well within the engagement envelope of radar-guided SAM systems that simply could not acquire and track them. On nights when weather permitted visual target acquisition, F-117 pilots reported watching Iraqi anti-aircraft fire arc into empty sky, tracers and missile exhausts creating spectacular displays as Iraqi gunners fired at nothing, unable to detect the aircraft overhead. The psychological impact on Iraqi defenders proved significant, creating an environment where every location became potentially vulnerable at any moment without warning or apparent defense. Lieutenant General Chuck Horner, who commanded the coalition air campaign, later acknowledged that the F-117 was the only airplane planners dared risk over downtown Baghdad, a statement that captured both the aircraft's unique capability and the extreme threat environment Iraqi defenses created. General Buster Glosson, who directed targeting and planning as 14th Air Division commander, called the F-117 wing the backbone of the strategic air campaign. The mathematics of force employment made the aircraft's value clear. 8 F-117s could strike 16 separate aim points in a single mission, while accomplishing the same objective with conventional aircraft would require a package of approximately 60 aircraft including 32 bombers, 16 fighter escorts, 4 electronic jamming aircraft, and 8 Wild Weasel defense suppression platforms. The F-117s operated independently, without the complex coordination and timing required for conventional strike packages, reducing airspace congestion and allowing commanders to respond more flexibly to changing priorities and intelligence. By the war's third week, confidence in the aircraft's survivability had grown so complete that planners assigned F-117s against targets in downtown Baghdad during the same time windows when cruise missiles were arriving, trusting that Iraqi defenders would remain unable to detect the stealth aircraft even while actively engaging other threats. The performance did not go unnoticed in Moscow, where military analysts had been carefully monitoring the air campaign since its opening hours. Soviet generals and defense ministry officials watched as their doctrine, their equipment, and their decades of air defense investment proved unable to counter a capability that violated fundamental assumptions about how modern air warfare functioned. The integrated air defense network defending Baghdad was built on Soviet models, using Soviet equipment operated according to Soviet doctrine by personnel trained in Soviet methods. Iraqi P-14 and P-15 search radars were Soviet designs, their SA-2, SA-3 and SA-6 surface-to-air missiles were Soviet weapons, their MiG-21, MiG-23, MiG-25 and MiG-29 interceptors were Soviet aircraft. The command and control system that linked radars, SAM batteries, anti-aircraft artillery and fighter controllers into an integrated network reflected decades of Soviet tactical development, combat experience and theoretical refinement. Against this system, designed explicitly to deny airspace to American aircraft, the F-117 flew at will, striking targets that should have been protected by multiple overlapping defensive layers. After the first week, after the first 100 sorties without loss, the operational reality became impossible to dismiss as luck or temporary Iraqi confusion. The tendency in some Soviet circles to depreciate the tactical advantages offered by the F-117's low observable features, documented in a 1992 RAND study by analyst Benjamin Lambeth, reflected an understandable reluctance to acknowledge that a fundamental shift in air warfare had occurred. Some Soviet commentators claimed that F-117s had received support from EF-111 jamming aircraft during strikes on Baghdad, an assertion later disproven by the Gulf War Air Power Survey, which confirmed that F-117s flew into, over, and through the heart of fully operating air defenses, with no support from electronic countermeasures. Others argued that Iraqi incompetence rather than American technology explained the results, suggesting that properly trained Soviet crews operating the same equipment would have achieved detection and engagement. The argument contained a kernel of validity. Iraqi air defense operators did make mistakes and failed to adapt as effectively as Soviet doctrine prescribed, but it ultimately avoided the central issue. The F-117's radar cross-section of 0.001 to 0.003 square meters meant that even perfectly functioning radars operated by superbly trained personnel would struggle to detect the aircraft at ranges sufficient for effective engagement. The physics of radar return, the same electromagnetic principles Petr Ufimtsov had explored in his 1962 paper, dictated that an aircraft designed to deflect 99% of incident radar energy would not produce returns adequate for track-quality data on radars designed to engage conventional aircraft. Throughout the 43 days of Desert Storm, the 42 F-117s deployed to Saudi Arabia flew approximately 1,300 sorties and delivered more than 2,000 tons of precision-guided munitions against 1,600 high-value targets. The Air Force initially claimed an 80% success rate, later revised to 75% based on post-war analysis that documented 1,669 direct hits and 418 misses or no-drops across approximately 1,280 sorties. Subsequent investigation revealed that approximately 480 bombs were not released during sorties, often due to weather obscuration or target identification difficulties, reducing the calculated hit rate to between 41 and 60% depending on how no-drops were categorized. The weather proved worse than in 14 years of historical records, with actual cloud cover of 39% compared to predicted 13%, and 5,000 to 7,000 foot cloud ceilings common over target areas. The first night attack on Baghdad failed to hit 40% of assigned air defense targets, and the Air Defense Operations Center in Baghdad survived multiple strike attempts with 8 of 10 accessible targets remaining functional after initial attacks. Commanders changed target assignments at the last minute based on evolving intelligence, weapons had range and accuracy limitations that weather exacerbated, and pilots sometimes declined to drop when civilians appeared near aim points. But the debate over hit rates, while important for understanding precision weapon capabilities and limitations, obscured the strategic reality that F-117 units demonstrated in Desert Storm. Zero aircraft losses against the most heavily defended airspace on Earth represented a revolution in air warfare regardless of whether individual bombs achieved direct hits. The 42 F-117s represented approximately 2.5% of coalition fixed-wing tactical aircraft, but struck 40% of strategic targets, demonstrating a force multiplication factor that transformed operational planning. The psychological impact on Iraqi commanders and defenders, knowing that critical facilities could be struck without warning and apparently without defense, affected decision-making throughout the Iraqi command structure. The Air Force could assign the F-117 force against downtown Baghdad targets while husbanding conventional assets for less defended objectives, optimizing the entire air campaign by matching capabilities to threats in ways that would have been impossible without stealth. Captain Scott Stimpett dropped the 1000th F-117 bomb on the 23rd night of the war, a milestone that captured the sustained operational tempo the small fleet maintained. By war's end, when the first 8 F-117s returned to Nellis Air Force Base on April 1, 1991 before 25,000 spectators, the aircraft's combat record had validated everything proponents had claimed and silenced most serious technical criticism. For Soviet military professionals and Russian analysts who succeeded them after the Soviet Union's collapse in December 1991, the F-117's performance created a doctrinal challenge that decades of investment and theoretical development had not prepared them to address. The integrated air defense network that had been the cornerstone of Soviet tactical planning since the 1950s, the system that had forced American bombers to abandon daylight operations over North Vietnam and had destroyed hundreds of Israeli aircraft over the Sinai and Golan Heights, could not effectively engage aircraft designed from conception to evade radar detection. The mathematical principles Ufimtsev had explored purely as theoretical research, principles Soviet military researchers had apparently considered insufficiently practical to classify or pursue, had enabled American engineers to create aircraft that rendered Soviet air defense architecture substantially less effective. The Soviet Union had begun its own stealth development program by the late 1980s, informed by intelligence collection on American programs and by increasingly detailed technical reporting in Western aviation press. But Soviet research had been in the assessment of Western analysts without rigor or true understanding until details of the FR-117 became public. The economic and political collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 effectively ended serious Russian stealth development for nearly 2 decades. When Sukhoi unveiled the first Russian stealth prototype in 2009, 28 years had passed since the first FR-17 flight. The operational vindication of stealth technology in Desert Storm accelerated American programs already in development and fundamentally altered air warfare planning for every nation with the technical capability and resources to pursue similar technology. The B-2 Spirit strategic bomber, which had made its first flight in July 1989, incorporated far more sophisticated stealth technology than the F-117, using curved surfaces that advanced computer modeling could now calculate instead of the faceted panels necessitated by 1970s computational limitations. The F-22 Raptor program, initiated in the 1980s, would integrate stealth with air superiority performance to create the first fighter designed from inception to be undetectable while maintaining combat capability against enemy aircraft. The F-35 Lightning II, conceived in the 1990s as a multi-role strike fighter with stealth characteristics and the ability to operate from conventional runways, aircraft carriers, and short vertical landing strips, would eventually become the most widely produced fifth-generation fighter in history. Each program built on lessons learned from the F-117's development and validated by its combat performance, creating a family of stealth aircraft that would define American air superiority for generations. But the F-117's apparent invulnerability proved not to be absolute, a lesson demonstrated 8 years after Desert Storm in the skies above Serbia. On the evening of March 27, 1999, Lieutenant Colonel Dale Zelko flew F-117A number 82-0806, callsign Vega 31, on a strike mission during Operation Allied Force, NATO's air campaign over Kosovo and Serbia. The aircraft, nicknamed Something Wicked, had flown 39 combat sorties during Desert Storm and had returned undamaged from all of them. Zelko himself was a Desert Storm veteran, intimately familiar with the F-117's capabilities and limitations. At approximately 8:15 p.m. local time, flying at 26,000 feet near the Serbian village of Budanovci, Željko's aircraft was struck by a surface-to-air missile fired from a Yugoslav version of the Soviet S-125 Neva system, designated SA-3 Goa by NATO. The SA-3 was a 1950s-era design, older and less capable than many of the systems that had failed to engage F-117s over Baghdad. The battery commander was Lieutenant Colonel Zoltan Dani, who had studied American stealth tactics and developed procedures specifically intended to counter the F-117's low observable characteristics. Dani's battery used a P-18 low-frequency surveillance radar that could detect the F-117 at approximately 14 miles under specific conditions, far less than the 100-plus mile detection ranges typical against conventional aircraft, but sufficient if employed cleverly. The critical tactical innovation was limiting radar activation to no more than 17 seconds total, brief bursts that made targeting by American anti-radiation missiles nearly impossible while providing just enough data to cue the SA-3's engagement radar. Dani's crew had studied F-117 operations during the first week of Allied force, noting patterns in routing, timing, and altitudes. On the night of March 27th, they positioned based on their analysis of likely approach routes and waited. When Željko's F-117 opened its weapons bay doors to release bombs, the momentary increase in radar cross-section provided the detection opportunity Dani's crew needed. They activated the fire control radar for seconds only, achieved a firing solution, and launched at least 2 SA-3 missiles. Željko later reported that the first missile caused buffeting but did not detonate, while the second struck the aircraft directly. He ejected successfully, landing approximately 1 mile from the crash site where he concealed himself in a ditch, while Yugoslav soldiers, police and local villagers searched the area, some passing within a few hundred meters of his position. The rescue came approximately 8 hours later, in the early morning of March 28th, when 2 Sikorsky MH-53 PAVE-low helicopters supported by an 8H-60 PAVE Hawk and A-10 escorts extracted Željko under fire from Serbian forces that had surrounded the general area. Željko would learn later that he had been minutes away from capture when the rescue force arrived. The aircraft had struck the ground inverted at relatively low speed, remaining largely intact, a fact that created immediate concerns about technology compromise. F-15E strike aircraft armed with AGM-130 standoff missiles went on alert to destroy the wreckage, but a CNN crew and civilians arrived at the crash site before the strike could be executed, making destruction politically impossible. On April 2nd, the Yugoslav government announced its intention to hand over pieces of the wreckage to Russia. A Russian trade delegation visited Serbia shortly afterward and salvaged materials and systems from the crash site. Russian officials later confirmed that examination of the F-117 wreckage contributed to development of the Sukhoi Su-57 fighter and Tupolev Pak-DA bomber programs. China allegedly purchased additional wreckage components, with Croatian military sources claiming in 2011 that Chinese agents scoured the area, buying recovered parts from local farmers. Western intelligence analysts assessed that Chinese examination of F-117 components contributed to development of the Chengdu J-20 stealth fighter. Paul Kaminsky, who had been involved in F-117 development, stated publicly after the shootdown that things in that aeroplane were certainly ahead of what some potential adversaries possessed, expressing concern about technology transfer. Other American officials downplayed the incident, claiming the F-117's technology was already dated and no longer important to protect. The contradiction reflected genuine uncertainty about how much Chinese and Russian engineers could learn from physical examination of stealth materials and structural components. Whatever the actual extent of technology transfer, the shootdown demonstrated that stealth technology did not render aircraft invincible, that clever tactics, operational analysis, and specific vulnerabilities like weapons bay door openings could create engagement opportunities even against low observable aircraft. The F-117 was low observable, not non-observable, a distinction that mattered greatly under specific tactical conditions. The aircraft had been designed in the 1970s when computing power limited design optimization and when specific threat systems dictated specific shaping solutions. By 1999, potential adversaries had 20 years of intelligence collection, technical analysis, and operational observation to inform counter-stealth tactics. Some Western analysts and Russian commentators cited the Serbia shootdown as evidence that stealth advantages had been exaggerated or that appropriate tactics could negate low observable technology. The argument missed the broader strategic context that 1,200 Desert Storm sorties without loss, followed by 8 years of operations over Iraq during which F-117 struck targets repeatedly without effective Iraqi response, had demonstrated. A single loss under specific circumstances, after more than 1,300 combat sorties validated rather than invalidated the stealth concept. Conventional strike aircraft operating against the same Iraqi air defenses that never successfully engaged an F-117 suffered losses and damage throughout Desert Storm and in subsequent operations through 2003. The mathematical reality remained that an aircraft with a radar cross-section 3 orders of magnitude smaller than conventional fighters would be dramatically more difficult to detect, track, and engage. Danny's success required tactical innovation, careful operational planning, pattern analysis, precise timing, a vulnerability window when weapons bay doors opened, and ultimately a measure of fortune when everything came together simultaneously. That such conditions occurred once in 1,300 sorties demonstrated not stealth's failure, but its profound operational impact. The F-117 flew its final combat missions during the opening nights of Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003, striking leadership targets in Baghdad, including the Dora Farms complex where intelligence suggested Saddam Hussein might be located. The aircraft had been in service for 22 years, its design dating to the mid-1970s, and newer stealth platforms with superior performance characteristics were entering service. The Air Force officially retired the F-117 fleet in 2008 during ceremonies at Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico, where the aircraft had been based since 1992, when operations transferred from the secret facility at Tonopah. Select airframes were maintained in flyable storage at Tonopah and have occasionally been observed flying since retirement, supporting classified test programs or providing aggressor training against low observable targets. 558 Air Force pilots flew the F-117 during its operational lifetime, each receiving a bandit number that identified them as members of the stealth community. The program had cost billions of dollars, had required operational security that lasted more than a decade, had created maintenance challenges unique in tactical aviation, and had validated a technology that skeptics in multiple countries had doubted could work. The aircraft's legacy extended far beyond its own combat record. The F-117 proved that aircraft could be designed primarily around radar signature reduction rather than aerodynamic performance, that stealth technology could survive the transition from theory to operational reality, and that low observable characteristics provided sufficient tactical advantage to justify the costs and compromises inherent in the design. Every American stealth aircraft that followed built on foundations the F-117 established, incorporating more sophisticated shaping algorithms made possible by improved computing power, advanced materials that reduced maintenance burden, and integrated design philosophies that balance stealth with other performance requirements more effectively than the stark trade-offs necessary in the 1970s. The B-2 Spirit strategic bomber, with its radar cross-section of 0.05 square meters and its ability to strike targets anywhere on Earth without refueling, represented stealth technology applied to penetration bombing. The F-22 Raptor, with its combination of stealth, supercruise capability, and air superiority performance, demonstrated that low observability could be integrated with fighter characteristics without the compromises that made the F-117 strictly a strike platform. The F-35 Lightning II, designed for multi-role operations from 3 different basing modes across multiple services and allied nations, showed that stealth could be incorporated into affordable, mass-produced tactical aircraft rather than remaining confined to small specialized fleets. For Russian and Chinese military planners, the F-117's combat record and the subsequent proliferation of American stealth platforms created strategic challenges that decades of investment in air defense systems had not prepared them to address. The integrated air defense networks both nations developed, heavily influenced by Soviet doctrine and in many cases employing Soviet-derived equipment, had been optimized to engage conventional aircraft with radar cross-sections measured in square meters. Against aircraft with signatures 3 orders of magnitude smaller, these systems faced detection and tracking challenges that could not be solved simply by adding more radars or improving signal processing. Some Russian officials continued to express public confidence that new radar systems, particularly those operating at lower frequencies with longer wavelengths, less susceptible to stealth shaping, would restore detection capabilities against American low-observable aircraft. Chinese defense industry sources made similar claims about counter-stealth radar development. Whether these systems could provide track-quality data at operationally useful ranges against aircraft like the B-2, F-22, or F-35 remained debatable and untested in actual combat, but the strategic reality that American stealth technology had forced adversaries to fundamentally rethink air defense architecture remained indisputable. The mathematics and physics that made stealth technology effective were not secret. Petro Ufimtsev's original paper had been published openly in 1962, and his work remained available in technical libraries worldwide. What separated successful implementation from theoretical understanding was the engineering discipline required to translate mathematical principles into physical aircraft, the manufacturing precision necessary to maintain design tolerances across thousands of components, the materials science needed to create radar-absorbent coatings that could survive operational environments, and the system integration expertise to combine stealth characteristics with weapons, sensors, propulsion, and flight controls into aircraft that pilots could employ effectively in combat. American aerospace industry had demonstrated these capabilities across multiple platforms over 4 decades, creating a family of stealth aircraft that operated successfully in combat environments, while potential adversaries remained in early development stages with prototype aircraft and uncertain operational timelines. The technological gap, validated in combat and sustained through continuous development, represented not merely hardware differences but fundamental advantages in industrial capacity, systems engineering, and operational experience. That gap traced directly back to the evening of August 20, 1990, when 18 F-117s landed at Karmis Mushat, and ground crews began preparing them for combat operations that would begin 5 months later. The confidence Captain Donaldson observed in F-117 pilots that night, the quiet certainty that came from years of flying an aircraft they knew could penetrate defended airspace conventional fighters could not approach, would be validated beyond any reasonable doubt in 1,300 combat sorties. Soviet generals who had laughed at American stealth claims in the late 1980s, who had expressed confidence that existing air defenses would prove adequate, who had argued that stealth represented incremental improvement rather than revolutionary capability, watched their doctrine and their equipment fail comprehensively against technology that Soviet theoretical mathematics had made possible, but Soviet engineering had failed to pursue. The tendency toward dismissiveness, documented in intelligence assessments and technical literature throughout the early 1990s, gradually gave way to acknowledgement that a genuine shift in air warfare had occurred, though some Russian military officials continued minimizing stealth advantages even as their own defense industry struggled to field competitive platforms decades behind American operational deployment. In the pre-dawn darkness of January 17, 1991, when Major Greg Feast released the first bomb of Desert Storm over an Iraqi interceptor operations center and 10 F-117s approached Baghdad from directions Iraqi air defense operators had not anticipated, an era of warfare ended and a new paradigm began. The integrated air defense network that had defined tactical aviation since the 1960s, the layered radar-guided weapons systems that had forced fundamental changes in American strike doctrine during Vietnam and had inflicted devastating losses on Israeli aircraft during Arab-Israeli conflicts, proved unable to defend against aircraft designed from conception to evade detection. The question of how many aircraft would be needed to destroy a target and how many losses would be acceptable in the attempt, questions that had dominated air campaign planning for 30 years, transformed into new calculations about which platforms could reach which targets and whether defended objectives could be struck without fighter escorts, defense suppression packages, and electronic jamming support. The F-117, flying from Saudi Arabian bases through Iraqi airspace to downtown Baghdad and returning night after night without loss, without damage, without effective Iraqi response, demonstrated that stealth technology worked exactly as its developers had claimed and that adversaries equipped with Soviet weapons and trained in Soviet doctrine could not counter it. If you found this exploration of how stealth technology transformed modern warfare compelling, what aspect of Cold War aerospace development would you want to understand more deeply? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to see how American submarine technology similarly outpaced Soviet capabilities in the underwater domain, hit subscribe, because that story reveals another dimension of technological dominance that Soviet admirals underestimated until it was far too late.